Chapter 36 of The Seventh Most Important Thing by Shelley Pearsall. "Whoa!" Arthur shouted, just about knocking Squeak flat to the ground behind him as he lurched backward in surprise. The old man was sitting in one of those rolling office-type chairs in the middle of the garage, with boxes scattered around his feet. Bright bits of foil covered his lap. "St. Arthur, come in!" Mr. Hampton turned his chair and gestured to them, smiling a little. "I wasn't expecting you today. I was informed that you were quitting." "And I was told you were dying," Arthur thought as he stood there stupidly staring at the guy who looked very much alive. Maybe a little thinner, but mostly okay, compared with the last time he'd seen him in the hospital bed. Mr. Hampton was wearing ordinary clothes. A baggy brown cardigan with a few holes in the sleeves sagged around his shoulders. He had on corduroy pants and scuffed shoes. Somewhere he'd found another pair of glasses to replace the broken ones. Behind the round black frames, the old man's eyes looked sharp and clear. "He changed his mind about quitting," Squeak piped up behind Arthur. Mr. Hampton's gaze shifted from Arthur to Squeak. "I see you've brought reinforcements." "This is Squeak," Arthur mumbled, stepping aside to let Squeak come in. "That's your friend's name? Squeak?" Just by the tone of Mr. Hampton's voice, Arthur could tell he didn't approve of the nickname. "It's Reginald, actually. I'm Reginald Buckley Pierce, sir." Squeak walked over to Mr. Hampton and stuck out his hand politely. "It's a pleasure to meet you." Good grief, Arthur thought. Squeak didn't need to recite his entire birth certificate for the guy. "Very nice to meet you, Reginald." Mr. Hampton shook Squeak's hand. Then he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands neatly in his lap. He reminded Arthur of the dignified Mr. Hampton from court again, only without the sling like the letter A across his chest. "Well, boys, I wasn't expecting company today, but I sure could use the help." He shook his head. "I lost a lot of time this week, way too much time. I had all sorts of big plans, and none of them happened, did they?" Arthur decided not to point out to Mr. Hampton that his plans hadn't worked out because he'd almost died in his garage. The old man waved one hand toward the shimmering work of art. "As you can see, my vision of heaven is far from complete." This was the first time Squeak and Arthur allowed their attention to turn toward the spectacular creation that filled the rest of the garage. Arthur heard Squeak whisper, "Wow." As Arthur gazed at the startling objects again, dozens upon dozens of glittering pieces crowded together, he could feel his heart fluttering just like it had when he'd first seen them. It reminded him of the feeling you got when you looked down from a tall building, how everything below looked real and unreal. That was how the creation made him feel, as if he was looking at something both real and unreal at the same time. Now he could see how some of the pieces were made of things he'd collected, just as Mr. Hampton had said. He recognized the red and gold throne chair he'd brought back from the big Victorian house, and a few of the small tables he'd found over the past 2 months. He was pretty sure the silver globes decorating many of the objects were light bulbs covered in foil, and nearly every square inch of everything else was covered in foil too. Squeak spoke up. "Arthur told me you're building heaven." "Yes," Mr. Hampton replied. "Actually, it's the throne of the third heaven. What do you think?" "I'm not sure." Squeak looked as if he couldn't quite believe his eyes. "Well, let me show you how it all started." Mr. Hampton rolled his chair closer to the radiant display. He pointed out a small box covered with layers of metallic decorations near their feet. It resembled a fancy jewelry box. "There, pick that one up," he told Arthur. "You pick it up, Squeak," Arthur insisted. "The box looks like it would fall apart if you breathed on it." "Are you sure?" Squeak glanced uncertainly at Mr. Hampton. Arthur could tell he didn't want to pick it up either. "Hand it to me," Mr. Hampton commanded. Acting like he was lifting a tray of eggs, Squeak slowly picked up the box and handed it to Mr. Hampton. "This was my first piece," the old man said. There was a little handwritten tag on it, Arthur noticed, in some strange language. "I made it on Guam after I had my first vision." Mr. Hampton looked sharply from Squeak to Arthur. "Now, which one of you knows where Guam is and why it's important?" Arthur was extremely relieved when Squeak jumped in to answer that it was an island in the Pacific where the Allies had fought the Japanese in World War II. Right then and there, Arthur decided that if he ever got on a quiz TV show, he'd definitely want Squeak on his side. "Very good, young man. He's a smart kid, isn't he? Keep him around," Mr. Hampton said to Arthur. Then his face grew serious. "I served on Guam in the Second World War, and when we got there, it was a terrible place. Everything was in pieces. Everywhere you looked, there were pieces of bombs, of planes, of people." As he spoke, Hampton's voice shook and the box trembled dangerously in his hands. Arthur thought they probably shouldn't be talking about war and upsetting the guy, especially since he'd just gotten out of the hospital. He glanced toward Squeak, trying to send him a subliminal message to change the subject. "Every night I had dreams, terrible dreams, about the things I saw," Hampton continued. Arthur's mind went back to his own bad dreams. The bottles rolling away, the cops coming to their door, trying to save his father and never succeeding. "And then one night," Mr. Hampton said, "I'd had enough. I couldn't stand the war any longer. I wanted to die and be done with it. And that's the night when I had my first vision, my first dream of building heaven out of broken things." He held up the fragile box for them to look at again. Now Arthur could see the bits of wood and glass and metal he'd used. Tiny nails and pins held the parts together. One piece of metal had numbers stamped on it. Another looked like a round silver button. There was a rusted hinge from something in metal, and a metal handle or knob from something else. "I made this box from the broken things I found on Guam. This is death and war, turned into something beautiful." It was beautiful. Arthur could hear himself gulp in the silence that followed. He swore he could hear Squeak's eyelids blinking really fast behind his glasses, too. Neither of them knew what to say. The usual things they might have said, "Cool, wow, that's great, that's crazy, nobody would guess that," seemed completely wrong. So they just stood there blinking and swallowing loudly. Finally, Squeak blurted out, "Why do you call it the throne of the third heaven?" "Don't know," Hampton shrugged his thin shoulders. He passed the small box back to Squeak, who set it gently on the floor. "It was the number I saw in my dream, a big number 3 in the sky." He drew the number in the air with his hand. "I never question what I'm told. Some things in this world are meant to remain a mystery." Mr. Hampton began rolling his office chair toward the far side of the garage with his feet. "Enough talking for now, boys. We've got a lot of work to do." The third most important thing. It is not easy to wrap a light bulb with tiny scraps of foil. Arthur discovered this pretty quickly. Mr. Hampton needed 10 light bulbs to decorate the top of a silver pedestal he was making for the collection. The pedestal would go to the left of the red chair, the throne, to balance a pedestal on the right. Everything in heaven was perfectly balanced, he said. Mr. Hampton used foil-wrapped bulbs to decorate a lot of his pieces. "Lights in the darkness," he called them. After making his first one, Arthur called them a big pain in the butt. First you had to put rubber cement on the light bulb. Not too much or it would drip all over the place, Hampton warned. Not too little or the foil would slide off. Then, with one hand carefully holding the sticky bulb, you had to grab a tiny square of tinfoil and press it firmly to the side, without breaking the bulb. This was the part of the process that made Arthur very nervous. The bulbs were glass, of course, ridiculously thin glass. Arthur's hands weren't very careful. He didn't trust himself not to crush, pulverize, or drop a bulb. Squeak had much more patience, and smaller hands. So Arthur would rush rubber cement onto the bulb and hand the foil scraps to Squeak, who would press them gently around the glass bulb, as if he was working with an unexploded bomb. Surprisingly, Arthur could still recognize where a lot of the foil scraps had come from. He could pick out the ones that were Squeak's lunch foil, the tops of TV dinner trays, Christmas gift wrap, and wine bottle wrappers. Arthur remembered how people in the neighborhood always used to call the junk man a crazy old drunk when they saw him sticking empty wine bottles and liquor bottles in his coat pockets. It made Arthur feel guilty to think about it now. Nobody would have guessed he was using them for their foil wrappers. "Best foil you can get, hands down," Mr. Hampton told Arthur and Squeak when he showed them how to wrap the bulbs. "The other stuff works fine, but the bottle foil has the most shimmer." He liked to use a lot of different layers on each bulb. More layers equals more shine. Arthur wasn't sure he believed this theory, but Squeak was the kind of person who followed the directions 100%. He insisted on wrapping every bulb in about a half-dozen layers. Every shiny corner had to be glued down and pressed perfectly smooth against the bulb. He wouldn't go on to the next one until Mr. Hampton inspected it and gave his approval. Arthur was glad when they finally finished the bulbs and could move on to something else. Their next job was much more suited to him. They had to smash a bunch of mirrors into tiny pieces. Now it was Squeak's turn to be nervous. They were supposed to put the mirrors in paper grocery bags and smash them with a hammer. That was the safest way to break them, according to Mr. Hampton. Once the mirrors were broken up, they poured the fragments into a box for him to use later as decoration on the wings. "Gives the angel wings their sparkle," he said. But Squeak was convinced that if they broke the mirrors, they'd be causing themselves years of bad luck. I don't think this is a good idea," he whispered to Arthur. "You're not supposed to break mirrors. It's really bad luck in a lot of cultures. Haven't you ever heard of a broken mirror bringing you 7 years of bad luck? I don't think we should be doing this." Arthur shrugged. I don't care. I've already had a ton of bad luck. I'm not afraid of a stupid mirror. He picked up the hammer, feeling strangely invincible. Maybe it'll have the opposite effect for me, he laughed. Who knows? Maybe smashing a mirror will bring me good luck. And then, after Squeak moved a safe distance away from the potential bad luck and closed his eyes, Arthur broke his first mirror. It felt good. Great, actually. Hand me another one, he said to Squeak, who looked reluctant to touch anything resembling a mirror. So Arthur picked out one by himself from the stack leaning against the wall of the garage and put it in a paper bag. Lifting his hammer, he shattered another one. It reminded him of his earth science class, of the continental plates cracking apart. Only he was the one shattering the plates. 14, Squeak said faintly. What? Arthur said, looking up. 14 years of bad luck, 7 times 2. I've already had that much bad luck in 1 year, Arthur said, feeling happier than he had in a long time. I'm going to break another one. And he did. 21, he and Squeak said together. Arthur broke 3 more mirrors before Hampton looked up from attaching a large pair of foil-wrapped angel wings to one of the pedestals. Okay, that's enough, boys. That's plenty of mirrors. You can stop now. Good, Squeak whispered, seeming relieved. Arthur wished he could have broken a few more, as he carried the 42 years' worth of bad luck, or good luck, depending on your perspective, over to Mr. Hampton. He felt as if he'd been set free of something, as if some big shadow over his life had been taken away. After his dad's accident, he'd spent months worrying about what might happen next. He'd worried about his mom and Barbara all the time. Then, after he threw the brick, he started worrying about who he was, whether he was a bad kid who'd end up in trouble just like his dad. It was a big mirror of bad luck hanging over his head every day. And now he had smashed that mirror into a million shiny pieces. This was the third important thing.